You're listening to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series,
a dedicated series that explores all things net zero carbon and sustainability within the built environment.
Don't miss any future episodes. Subscribe at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to the Place Northwest podcast. I'm Julia Hatmaker, Deputy Editor for Place Northwest, and your host for today's episode, which I am very excited to tell you is all about electric vehicles. It seems like every new development under the sun is including electric vehicle charging units nowadays, which makes sense as we all move away from fossil fuels in an attempt to meet the nation's net zero carbon goals. But while deciding you want EV chargers in your scheme is an easy decision, what's harder is figuring out the best ways to include them, which is why I've recruited environmental planner Andrew Cook, an executive director with Pegasus Group with more than 35 years of experience in landscape planning, to share some of his wisdom. Pegasus Group is a leading development consultancy specializing in planning, design, environment, economics, heritage, transport and infrastructure, and property. So after that little bit of an introduction, welcome Andrew to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
So we want to put an EV charging unit into our scheme. It strikes me that there are like two big questions you need to answer. And the first of which is, how will they be powered?
Yes.
So we have a couple options there.
So clearly it's all well and good installing an EV charging point, but we do need to think about how it is going to be powered, how we are going to get electricity to that charging unit for the EV vehicles. So we do need to give that some careful consideration. What you would typically expect is for those EV charging stations to be connected to the grid. The grid, in other words, the network of electricity that flows through the infrastructure through the UK. Now, you would ordinarily expect that in terms of electricity that you draw from an EV charging unit being connected to the grid, you've got your electricity there, but we need to think carefully about where that electricity is coming from, because electricity in the grid can come from a number of sources. It could come from, say, nuclear generated electricity, or it could come from fossil fuel electricity generation in the form of gas-powered power stations, or indeed coal-powered power stations. So just because we're thinking about drawing electricity out of an EV charging station for an electric car, which on the face of it seems a sensible thing to do in terms of decarbonising our usage of cars and transportation system in the country, we do need to think carefully about where that electricity is coming from in terms of its source. And in an ideal world, what we should be thinking about is that the electricity that we're drawing off from those EV charging stations is coming from renewable energy sources. And the two principal ways in which we currently generate renewable energy at the moment in the UK is through wind energy and through solar energy. Solar farms, wind farms. Wind farms can be either onshore or offshore. So if we have a scenario where we're using those in terms of generating electricity, which we regard as clean, green, renewable energy, and that electricity is being fed into the EV charging stations, then that's great. That's where we need to be. Now, what we need to think about is where those EV charging stations may be located. For example, we could think about locating those in streets, in street scenes. They could be associated with car parks, with places that we typically travel to where we park our vehicles, such as supermarket car parks or municipal car parks in towns. But we also need to think about our highway road infrastructure that we all use to travel with our vehicles. And at various locations, we need to ensure that we've got suitable infrastructure in terms of EV charging stations across that road network, highway network. And it may be that whilst it's a good idea to think about, say, having a new EV charging station on some principal highway network, but if it's in the middle of nowhere and there is no grid in that location at the moment, we need to think about how are we going to get electricity into those charging units. So one way, for instance, would be to think about generating renewable energy either on-site, we refer to it as either being on-site or near-site to those EV charging stations. So for instance, we're working on 2 schemes at the moment where these are standalone, will be new EV charging stations, and will take on the appearance pretty much as we understand a petrol filling station to look at the moment. So you'd park, you'd come off the highway into those EV charging stations to charge your car, but they're in remote locations, not close to any grid. So in those instances, what we're seeking to do is actually install and secure planning permission for a solar farm that is located just close to that EV charging station, so that we can have a private wire that runs from that solar park and directly into the charging station. So that's not dependent on the grid. And then if you introduce battery storage as part of the solar farm, then it means when you've got an excess or a significant amount of solar energy being generated, you can store it on site in the battery storage units. And then on those occasions when you may say have low solar energy being generated and you need to top it up, you can top it up with a battery storage facility. And that way you achieve what we refer to as harmonization of energy flow.
Who doesn't love harmonization? I mean, it's a great word. I feel like one of the key things you were discussing there, it's either you're going to go grid or you're going to go private wire. And obviously, it sounds like private wire is the better way to go because you can ensure it's coming from a sustainable source and it's not going too far and there's a way that it can handle it. I know we've talked with other people about the grid and like making sure that the infrastructure is in place there that can handle the amount of electric vehicles that are going to be on the road someday.
Yes.
And making sure, like you were saying, it's not coming from fossil fuel sources. Because it sounds like to me, I would be like, oh, yeah, I've got an electric vehicle. I've saved the planet. And then I would realize belatedly I was filling it with electricity that was garnered from coal and then just feel awful about myself.
That scenario is possible. Clearly, there are energy companies, and some of those energy companies are providing EV charging stations. And those energy companies have contracts to ensure that the energy that they're using is coming from renewable sources. So it can be specified, but it does need to be specified. Otherwise, there would be uncertainty and a question mark against that. It does make sense in terms of it's a well-known fact that wherever you generate electricity and then you pump that into the grid, you feed it into the grid, it goes down the grid and it's extracted and used somewhere in the economy elsewhere. But there is an efficiency issue there. In other words, as you move electricity around the grid, you do lose some of that electricity through resistance, through the cabling, through the infrastructure network. So if you can generate electricity and use it close to where you're generating that electricity, you're minimizing the amount of distance that you have to move that electricity through the grid. You're reducing your resistance and you're reducing the amount that you actually lose in transmission. So that's an efficiency point, which should also be borne in mind, as well as a connectivity point to the grid.
And it sounds like to me, being very ignorant, so I'm not pretending to be an expert here, but it sounds like that would make solar panels like a really great choice, and to kind of like think about solar power as the way to be fueling these things.
Yeah, I would agree. I think on balance, I think from a planning perspective, it is easier to accommodate solar farms and solar panels than it is to accommodate wind energy. And I'll give you a for instance of that. Let's take a high density urban environment where we're thinking of putting, say, a new EV charging station, and we wanted to have renewable energy generated close to that new facility. In that sort of urban environment, the opportunity to, say, locate wind turbines would prove probably to be quite challenging, because you need to think about the distance the distances and the type of location that you need to be able to accommodate that sort of wind turbine structure. Where if you think about solar panels, you've got quite a range of opportunities where you could actually introduce those and effectively superimpose those over the urban area. And that could be by means of, say, large-scale rooftops, over, say, rooftops associated with conference halls, with large office blocks, with large distribution warehousing, basically anywhere where you've got a large area of roofscape that is reasonably level, then that's an ideal location perhaps where to introduce solar panels. Or for example, you might be looking at areas where you've got large areas of hard standing in an urban area, such as, let's say, a large supermarket car park. At the moment, it's just a tarmac macadam surface and cars parked there. But it's quite interesting. When I was traveling in Europe before the pandemic, and I was going through some relatively remote towns in France, some of the supermarkets there, they have superimposed arrays of solar panels as almost like panels, almost like bike shed roofs over all the car parking bays. So that your vehicle comes in, you park in the car park in the normal way, but you're under effectively not a carport, but a carport which extends over the entire car park of solar panels. So you've got a solar farm superimposed over the car park.
Wow.
So you've got a synergy there, haven't you? So you can see that there's a much easier way of accommodating solar panels in that sort of urban environment. Then if you turn to the countryside, where, for example, you might have a major highway and you want to introduce a solar farm, introduce an EV charging station, and you're thinking about renewable energy nearby, that may be a suitable location where you can relatively easily accommodate, say, a wind farm and some wind turbines without the same sort of constraints you'd have in an urban area. But equally, again, with solar farms, you can introduce those panels across the countryside, across the farmland, across those fields. Fields are generally managed as either for arable purposes or for pastoral purposes. The beauty of solar panels is that you can superimpose those relatively easily within the existing field structure without any harm to the grain of the landscape in terms of the existing pattern and network of hedgerows and trees, because you're siting them within the fields. And you're not taking away the agricultural function, because those fields can continue to be grazed for pasture, principally by grazing, having sheep and flocks of sheep in those fields, which can quite happily graze under the solar panels. So you've got your solar farm superimposed over the retained agricultural function of those fields. So retain the grazing function and still generate your renewable energy close to where you might need it in terms of an EV charging station.
As you mentioned, I thought it was really interesting the first point you made, which is, if you want to have it on a highway, which kind of has to be done if we're going to all be using electric vehicles, they need to be in slightly inconvenient spots that are actually super convenient. If you're going to have it there, you need to have those power considerations of, you're in the middle of nowhere, where are we getting our power from?
Right.
But there are other options as well for where you could be putting these units, correct?
Yes, there are. I mean, there's a whole range of potential opportunities to introduce EV charging stations. The key thing to think about all the time is about convenience. So it needs to be a location where a vehicle would be situated. What you don't want to be doing is introducing an EV charging station in a location that is inconvenient to the user of the vehicle, such that they've got to make a dedicated trip to an EV charging station, because that way you're generating more motor miles, which is unnecessary. And actually, whilst you might be using electricity, and it may be clean, renewable energy electricity at that, it's still a journey that is simply not required. So the key thing has got to be about convenience. And of course, that's what we see currently with the petrol filling stations in terms of where they're located. They're always in convenient locations where they are located adjacent to passing traffic. So, but you've got more new opportunities with charging stations in a way that you don't have with the traditional forecourt filling station. And if I can just explain what I mean by that. So let's start with the domestic situation where you've got a home and you've got a house with a driveway and perhaps a garage. And you can bring your vehicle off the road and within the curtilage of your property. Now, a number of developers are starting to think about siting and locating individual charging stations associated with individual properties, so that the person who has the electric vehicle can come home of an evening, plug the car in, charge it overnight, perhaps on low energy rates, and then unplug it in the morning and then drive off. So that's an ideal situation, isn't it? But there are situations, and let's just think about some of the urban locations, say inner cities, where you've got lots of high-rise and density living, high-rise and high-density living, where people are living in apartments, or they may be living in a terrace, which is back of pavement, where they don't have the luxury of bringing a vehicle to their residential, to their property. So in those instances, we need to think about, well, what is the next best opportunity? What could we do perhaps in terms of those street scenes? Now, interestingly, if you think of most urban street scenes, there are electricity points, usually at fairly regular locations down the street. We don't think of them as that, but they are the lighting columns that we're all very familiar with. They all draw electricity from the grid. So there is electricity infrastructure in place at those regular intervals. And perhaps what we should be looking at, and this would be an interesting development, which I'm sure will come forward in a relatively short period of time, is to look at the opportunity of having a dual function of a lighting column together with an EV charging station associated with it. So a vehicle could park up close to that lighting column, plug in, and charge the car. Now, that might suit some locations, but of course those locations again are going to be quite limited, and we'd have to think about how those bays close to those lighting columns are going to be managed on a day-to-day basis to allow free flow of vehicles so that they're not blocked effectively. So that's another option and something to consider, which currently we don't have the benefit of in terms of traditional fueling petrol filling stations. There are other options. You've got, for example, we're all very familiar with going to a supermarket, and many of the independent supermarkets have their filling stations adjacent to their car park. And we're all very familiar with going to the car park, parking up, doing our shopping, and then getting the fuel on the way out. So there's an immediate opportunity to introduce a banks and significant number of charging stations within those car parks as an alternative to the petrol filling stations. But again, if you're thinking of those locations and you think about the extent of the hard surface which is in place for those car parks, and you think about the extent of the roofscape associated with those supermarkets, if you were to introduce solar panels associated with those roofscapes and car parking, you're generating electricity in a renewable form at source and on site to be able to be drawn down by those charge stations within the existing supermarkets. That's another opportunity. And a similar opportunity, I suppose, might exist with regard to municipal car parks, and they be operated in exactly the same sort of way. And again, the opportunity of introducing solar arrays superimposed over large-scale supermarket car parks or airport car parks, for example.
That is one thing we're definitely seeing a lot more car parks incorporating electric vehicle charging units. Which makes sense because obviously you're parked there, you're going to be there. Ideally, you're going to be there for a while as you check out the city. So why not? And as you mentioned, like it sounds like it's a no-brainer when it comes to popping some solar panels on there and making sure that you're getting your energy in a sustainable way.
Exactly.
As well.
On the face of this, all of this sounds eminently sensible and very straightforward.
It does.
The fly in the ointment we need to be mindful of is that the government has set very ambitious targets in terms of decarbonising the economy generally, and with specific reference to decarbonising the private car ownership across the country. and a move to electric vehicles from traditional combustion engines, which on the face of it is a great idea. But what we need to think about is that in terms of the overall electricity that is generated in the country is a certain quantum. If then we decide that the entire private car usage of the country is going to be powered by electricity, that is a significant additional quantum of electricity that has to be generated that currently isn't generated by electricity because we rely upon diesel, we rely upon fossil fuels, diesel and gas and petroleum for powering traditional combustion engines. So we're going to have to, as an economy, significantly ramp up the increase in the generation of electricity if we are to hope to be able to power all the private vehicle usage that we're very familiar with across the country. Because at the moment, it's coming from fossil fuels. So that is a significant increase in new electricity that needs to be generated. It can come from renewables in the form of primarily wind and solar, but we do need to think about significant increase in the deployment of renewable energy in the form of solar farms and wind farms if we're going to be able to meet this significant increase in demand that will come from an increase in EVs being owned and operated.
Yeah, and I know with an earlier podcast we also did with Pegasus, we were talking about wind power specifically and what needs to be done to make that a more accessible and a more popular way, and it involves a lot of like upgrading existing wind farms, also making sure that we actually produce more, and communities need to say that like, yes, I want to have one in my hood, like it's got to be okay with that. But kind of thinking about the public sector and what needs to be done, what do you think? Obviously we're tackling in, they need to be pushing for renewable energy sources and making sure we're generating more energy that way. What else should the public sector be doing?
The conduit for all of these things that we're talking about in terms of built infrastructure, whether it's the EV charging stations themselves, wherever they're located, and in terms of the electricity that's generated for them in terms of wind farms and solar farms, all of this has got to be, in the main, consented through the local planning authorities, the local councils. And by far and away, the majority of the councils at the moment in recent years have all declared climate emergencies. And they've set out their climate emergency strategy in terms of objectives that they're setting. But they need to deliver on those objectives. So it's one thing to set out those objectives in some document and in perhaps the development plan, which guides and steers development for the plan period, which may be set for a 10 or 15-year period from now. But they've got to deliver on that and make some hard decisions, because it's no good having those objectives and then resisting change that comes along. Because if you're looking at significant infrastructure in terms of wind farms and solar farms, that is going to bring about change. But we all know that we're creatures of habit, and it's human nature. We tend to resist change. So there's a general presumption, certainly at the local level and at community level, that if change is proposed, it doesn't really matter whether it's housing or it's a new energy park. There is general resistance. And I think we do need the local planning authorities to step up and become emboldened to deliver on these various types of infrastructure if we're going to have a chance of meeting the government's aspirations and objectives, and indeed the local authority objectives and aspirations about decarbonising the economy and moving over to electric vehicles as part of that equation.
And I know in some parts of the UK, the government's already taken action to help fund these electric vehicle charging units. In Wales, for example, they've decided they're going to fund a whole slew of EV units across North Wales in communities that they felt like really needed them, that wouldn't be able to get them otherwise. So they've chipped in a good amount of funding to make it happen. It sounds like that's probably something that the rest of the government should do as well. unless you disagree with me, which is totally allowed.
Absolutely. I think, it's generally a case of carrot and stick, isn't it? I think you need all the positive direction and travel and policy, and that's all good, but it needs to be followed up with some significant financial incentives, if you like, to ensure that the private sector step in and take those initiatives, take up those financial incentives to deliver.
Yeah, I have to say, Andrew, I'm so glad that you mentioned carrot and stick because I mention it in every single podcast, actually, because it feels so true. Like that's the way to motivate people. You have to, provide an incentive and also a punishment, and then things start to happen.
Or
So,
carrot and reward is even better rather
oh,
than
that's
carrot and
true.
stick. Just carrot and
Double
reward.
incentive.
Yeah.
But yeah, let everyone listen to the podcast know I did not say the phrase this time. It was not me. So, Andrew, I want to be as green and good as possible. I want to put an EV charging unit. What should I do to do this as sustainably as I possibly can? Where should I go? How should I get in my power? Paint the picture.
I think you need to try and, first of all, establish that in terms of the electricity that is going to come through to the EV charging station is renewable. And if you're going to adopt the cleanest approach, then it would make sense to try and have the generation of that electricity as close as possible to the point where it's being drawn from the charging station, because that way you're minimizing the transmission and any loss through transmission through the grid. So I think those are the two key considerations. I think it's also important to think about it needs to be most convenient in terms of location. So there was one scenario I was looking at for a developer recently where there was discussion about a particular location. I was saying, well, that's all well and good, but it's off the general it's off the general main highway network, such that if you were going to use that facility, you'd have to drive to it. It'd have to become a destination in its own right to actually charge the car up and then come back to the network, which seems rather counterintuitive and inefficient. So I think the other thing to bear in mind is it needs to be located. They do need to be located at the most convenient location. And that may be where we generally visit fairly frequently. So the obvious places are, say, supermarkets where we all travel with a car, do the week shopping. We're in the shop and the town for a period of time, say an hour and a half. Again, it's a reasonable period of time over which to get the car charged, come back to. It's effortless, isn't it? Rather than actually going out of your way to somewhere where you'd have to charge it. And charge stations located in individual homes, again, makes sense. Why wouldn't you pursue that as well? But clearly there are going to be efficiencies going to be achieved if you've got effectively commercial charge stations.
Right. So to kind of recap, we've tackled the two big questions that come about when you decide you want to incorporate electric vehicle charging units into a scheme. The first of which, how you're powering it, make sure you're doing it sustainably. And the second
Yes.
of which, deciding where it's going to go. And there's multiple options there. Like, obviously, as we discussed, the supermarket is a great place. Retail parks, always a good option as well. I don't think we touched on that one as much, but it's the same kind of scheme as the supermarket.
Same scenario, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's a retail destination where you park up, you're doing your shopping for a while, the vehicle's parked up on some tarmac in a large car park. So it's similar scenario as a supermarket.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. I spend probably way too much time at retail parks, to be honest with you, so I could get a lot of charging done. We could also have it at home where we're going to be spending a lot of time, but obviously that has some severe flaws depending on where you live. For example, I'm in terraced housing, so the idea of having a charging unit in my rental accommodation doesn't make any sense. But if we were able to put it on things like lamppost and kind of incorporate those spots on the way, sounds very sensible. Multi-story car parks was mentioned, and then general like EV stations that are kind of like the way we treat forecourts, like
Yes.
petrol forecourts now.
Yes.
It makes a lot of sense as well.
Yes. Yeah, they would be identical in appearance, if you like. You would pull in off the road. You'd have banks of charge stations like we're familiar with the standard fuel pumps. You'd park up the car, plug it in. go into your retail offering, whether maybe a cafe, get a coffee, read a book, pop to the loo. There might be a picnic spot nearby. That's all the sort of thing we're very familiar with, isn't it? Particularly with the motorway service areas. I do know that some of the motorway service providers are looking at their locations and what agricultural land, because they're generally in the countryside,
Right.
because they're obviously linked to motorways, linking towns. But the main length of the motorway is in the countryside, and that's where you find the motorway service areas. They're adjacent to farmland, and again, that's a perfect opportunity to look at renewable energy being generated nearby. And it's an obvious synergy, isn't it? And you're not necessarily taking the farmland away, whether it's a wind farm, because wind turbines have got a very small footprint, whilst they've got a large vertical profile. Their footprint is very, very small in terms of being sited within a field, and so its arable or agricultural function, pastoral function, can continue. And the same with solar, the pastoral function can continue. So it's not introducing one form of infrastructure at the cost of losing farmland. Far from it. You can have the two together and they can coexist.
I think the thing I love about this discussion is it is just really hammered in that you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to be considerate and asking questions and really thinking the whole way through when it
Mm.
comes to putting in these units. Like, it's not like you need to make something revolutionary and change the world. Like, it can be as simple as like thinking about where people are and then
Mm.
how you're getting your energy. It's not as difficult as it might seem, I
Mm.
guess.
And whether it's the public sector and local planning authorities or developers, or central government, I think, to be fair, I think most of us are on the same wavelength, and we were committed to achieving this. It's just seeing it through, really, and making sure that we think it through and join the dots, whatever phrase you want to use, to make it happen. But there's no point thinking about one aspect in isolation. It does need to be thought through in terms of, well, how's this going to work through? So yes, great idea having, say, some EV charging stations at a motorway service area. But where's the electricity going to come from? Because at the moment, the tankers arrive and fill up those fuel stations with diesel or petrol. That's got to be transported. So the fuel's got to be brought. Same with renewables, the fuel has got to be brought to those locations. It just happens it's going to be electricity. So in some ways, it's easier to transport it and, as I say, generate it nearby, perhaps.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I feel like I learned an awful lot in the past 20
Good.
minutes. Thank you.
Good. You're very welcome.
I'm Julia Hatmaker. Thank you so much for listening to the Place Northwest podcast. If you want to find out more, check out pegasusgroup.co.uk, or you can always email inquiries@pegasusgroup.co.uk.